All right, The Political Economy of Hip Hop Music by Professor Stephen Ferguson, Chapter 4. As he starts off here, political economic issues are central to the music we listen to, beneath the glimmering facade of wealth, power, and happiness, sung about in songs and displayed in music videos and award shows. There's a long, twisted tale of the exploitation of artistic labor. In this chapter, I examine the political economy of the music industry. To examine the production of music is to pay close attention to its social relations of production. The social relations of production are the starting point for music's modes of consumption, distribution, exchange, and circulation. While money in various forms plays a role in the production, circulation, and consumption of music, it is capital as a social relation which shapes the music commodity. Through an examination of hip hop music, I argue that the music industry is a microcosm of the capitalist productive process. The goal of the music industry is the production of surplus value, which is the result of the exploitation of the artistic labor of songwriters, performers, and musicians. So I noted here that he ignores the 360 deals and their meaning and impact. And by that I mean the 360 deal, just very quickly, is the advancing imperialist, in my version, encroachment on the artists that says not only will we make money, that is the the studios who own the music through copyright, not only will we make the money from the sale of CDs, albums, cassettes, streams, etc., but anything you do associated with your brand. That's what the 360-degree deal. And for me, this is important because I think the goal of the music industry is more than just the production of surplus value. And that's where the colonial piece comes in. And that's where other pieces for me that I would describe in today more along the lines of counterinsurgency, of psychological warfare, but and as I was talking about then, of colonial dominance. That is the management of public opinion, the management of the colonial order, the self concept of the colonizer, that there's more than just surplus value being generated here. There's to me, there's something immaterial happening as well. And that's where I thought internal colonialism kicked in. And by not catching that component of the 360 deal in particular, and seeming to just focus on the traditional exchange in the music industry and not this increased control and involvement through the 360, I think he's beginning already to miss the point. Anyway, consequently, this is where I do agree, and I like this point here. Consequently, the only hope for hip hop artists under capitalism is the formation of a revolutionary union movement which struggles against class exploitation. So, on this point, well, I don't know about only hope, but I really do like a focus on something practical, legal, above board, overt, something that can be conceived of. There have been various attempts historically over the last couple of decades to do something akin to this, but not in the way that he's describing. And I agree that this would be great if there was similar to what I've argued around this whole thing about buying power. Like it stop focusing on the exclusive relationship, or don't stop focusing exclusively on the particular relationship black people have to the economy, uh, because by so doing it worsens black people's relationship to the economy by having black people try to struggle against this exclusively on their own, independent of other efforts, while trying not to in many ways to destroy the system, but engage it, defeats or weakens that struggle. And I think a parallel exists there, at least, you know. So this chapter is essentially a study in Marxist political economy. Our starting point is that economics cannot be separated from politics. We do not disagree there either. In cultural studies circles, it is common to place the value of music outside of commodity production, as I just did. So I'm guilty of that there. As we have seen in chapter 1, the work of John Fiske may serve as a representative example of this approach. From this perspective, value is placed on the cultural meaning or significance of music for the listener, fan, or consumer. In order to weld culture and politics together, cultural studies must discount the significance of the political economy of culture. Now, what I wrote in my note here and why Ferguson struggles with my analysis, I include both and show their interrelationship beyond the confines of a more doctrinaire Marxist approach. But so to call me out, as we'll get to in a moment, as part of this problem, this is where I just think he gets this wrong. I mean, maybe there are others who do this and he should have picked them and used their work, but he picks me and then poorly addresses my work. In other words, he doesn't as they say, straw man the argument for me and then show where the flaw is in my work. He just throws out, as we'll see. But but I but in this sense, I agree. I don't think he understands. This is what when I'm also thinking in terms of media studies. I'm also now, of course, thinking in terms of psychological warfare, counterinsurgency. But the point being, even when I was writing I Mix What I Like, I was thinking in terms of media studies, even psychological warfare, and the idea that there is more to the value placed on the cultural meaning of or significance of music or listener, um, that more value should be placed, or at least paralleling or an equal amount of value should be placed in an analysis of this problem on the cultural meaning and the significance of the music for the listener, the fan, or the consumer. That's part of the process. That's part of the mechanism of maintaining colonial control, capitalist exploitation. I so I just think he does not get this part right. Um, similarly, I thought this part was odd too because I also he references Frank Kafka's work on black music, white business, who was a Marxist, as showing what the correct forms of scholarship on this. I also use Kafka's work to make my argument. So I that's embedded in my argument. So is the work of Thomas J. Porter, my godfather, of course, who's the social roots of Afro-American music does come out of, again, the Robert Rhodesian, because of course they worked together at Antioch College, as did my father, in the graduate program there. But but I don't know that I would have to go back and read that particular essay. I don't know. I'll ask him. I don't know that. In fact, I should have done it. You know what? I don't know. I didn't think to do it before today, but I will ask Mr. Porter to what extent he feels he was referenced here accurately, and in terms of what does he think about my argument. I don't remember us talking about this specifically, but yeah. But anyway, my point is I agree with a lot of their analysis. So I admit I Mix What I Like does not get the Marxism right, but not because I'm trying to erase Marx or a Marxist approach. I'm just trying to, I thought, show how it worked and interacted nicely with my at least variation of an internal colonialism theory. Same thing with Theodore Adorno, the Frankfurt School. I've referenced, I talk about a lot. In my work, I'm a big fan of, but I think it's important to note that Adorno didn't like jazz. Adorno didn't really have an affinity for or an understanding of Black people or their experience here, which is, I think, always what's sort of the point with this sort of, again, strict doctrinaire Marxist approach, that it as much as I and others appreciate it, it doesn't, it's just, it's incomplete. But I don't find it being I don't by that I don't mean to say that it's not of great value and should be ignored. I just think it can be worked within certain various approaches. And as I had the internal colonialism piece, okay. Here he says, of all the dimensions of popular music that are written about, the web-like industry behind the production of the music is oftentimes invisible to the consumer of music. And then I wrote in my note here, wow, his later criticism of me ignores that my chapter on copyright, which is what he's talking about, is one of the several in succession in the book breaking down in detail this exact web. So again, I didn't understand why I'm being the one he ends up using as an example of what's. So I look forward to, hopefully, he'll have this discussion with me, and this, like, how does my book not do this? I mix what I like, a mixtape manifesto. It I think does a really good job of breaking down the web-like industry. I have even included diagrams and a breakdown of each step, from copyright to payola to the uh, uh, intersection and the incestuous relationships between major conglomerates and the subsidiaries that ultimately own the largest music companies. I show how that ownership ends up manipulating and determining what becomes popular music in the Black community and elsewhere. So I just don't. This part falls. Again, I would have preferred he would explain here who are these who often write about but ignore this breakdown. He's talking about the monopoly character of the music industry and the big three. I talk about the big four at the time. I talk about Sony, BMG, EMI, and not only that, I go beyond what he does here. I show who owns them, the international conglomerates that own them. I show who owns Universal Music Group and Sony, and the percentage of Sony Music Corp that is Sony Music, and the percentage of Universal Music that was Vivendi, and the percentage of Warner Music Group that was the subsidiary of Blavatnik's Allied Industries. So again, I'm not understanding how we I have the whole point of my chapters breakdown is so that we can look explicitly at the contract and how it is a subset of copyright, which is itself a subset of intellectual property. And then I show how intellectual property, as part of this, is one of the biggest industries in this country that doesn't make much materially, but owns everything. And I called it the ownership of thought. So then again, this ill-defined, vague they in Black cultural studies, which I don't, you know, they rarely raise questions about the legitimacy of capitalist ownership of the music industry. I actually show how the capitalist music ownership of the music industry functions within the colony. So I'm like, the paralysis of analysis is Reaganomics. Salute to the man that died during my wedding. I literally talk about sampling not only as a technology, but how sampling changed the music. That through white law firm and corporate ownership of Black art, through the accumulation of copyright control of artists' music, I showed how, and the increase in fees that would then accompany attempts to sample. I showed how this literally changed music, taking us out of the boom bap era that required sampling from live instruments, but that people could no longer afford. And turned it into the version that we have ultimately today, something that sounds very different. So I incorporated all of that. Where would hip hop be without the production of sampling and talent of Rick Rubin, DJ Premier, Pete Rock, Prince Paul, and the Bomb Squad, among others? And then I put in my question here in my note here, but Fanon asked, where would jazz be without enslavement? So, I mean, my point is, he's saying that there is so he's saying there's a dialectical unfolding of hip hop music that was the introduction of sampling technology. I showed that same dialectical unfolding as being European technology being repurposed by a colonized Black community that was being forcibly cut off through public policy from being taught live instruments and developing live bands. And that this led to a need for the repurposing of that existing technology to create both scratching and then sampling and so on and so on. But how all of this became colonized and ended up benefiting to this day the same big four or big three that are in control. The well, now big six if you connect them to the incestuous new relationship with streaming platforms. So I'm like, where? So where would hip hop production and sampling be? It was forcibly changed. There can be no more Pete Rock's premieres and Prince Paul's because of what I talk about in my work, the encroachment of both copyright and specifically the damage it did to sampling. So you can't have these folks anymore. Prince Paul produced De La Soul, who was mentioned here. But Ferguson doesn't talk about what happened to De La, largely because of the sampling technology that was still managed and maintained by the corporations that would ultimately manage the copyright, that would ultimately determine that groups like De La Soul would be shelved only to appear on streaming platforms as Dave is passing on, rest in power. So I don't, you know, music is usually understood as an object of consumption rather than an object that is produced. Cultural production cannot be separated from the labor relations and conflicts in which it is involved. Again, how do I fit in as a target of this criticism? This is exactly my point. The whole point of I Mix What I Like was to break down the process by which popularity is produced in service of colonial maintenance. So it was not, I was only identifying why we consume what we consume because it is produced. And I explained the political economy of that production. So I absolutely did not separate cultural production from labor relations or the conflicts involved. I used it to highlight. In fact, my whole point is if you understand the history of the mixtape and what happened to the mixtape and in the context in which the mixtape existed, then it was specifically to focus on the conflicts involved. So I'm like, I don't know where or why or how we end up where we end up, which is here. It is not accurate to describe the exploitation of Black artists as a postmodern form of colonialism, as Norman Kelly describes it. The exploitation of Black artists should not be described as Black artists being colonized by the major recording companies, aided by and abetted by Blacks. The music industry, by the way, that's not my argument. In fact, I know he's quoting Kelly there, but my argument, this is why I feel like he doesn't do enough to distinguish or pay attention. My argument was not that Black artists were being colonized by record companies. My point is, and my whole book and my whole argument over and over and over again, maybe to a fault, was repeatedly saying Black people are colonized. Therefore, whatever they produced has to be understood in that context. And in fact, to this day, I hate when people say XYZ is colonizing this, that, and a third. And in fact, I say it in my book. There's a line in the book somewhere that says it's not that XYZ is being colonized, it's that what X, Y, and Z is being produced in the context of colonialism. Therefore, of course, what happens in that context is part of that process. So then Ferguson writes here, exploitation is a universal phenomenon experienced by all musicians who sell their artistic labor power, whether it is major or independent music labels, whether it is major or independent music labels. Unfortunately, the analysis offered by Norman Kelly and Jared Ball ignores the fact that this is a phenomenon experienced by Black, white, Asian, and Latino musicians of all genres. No, I never did. Nowhere in my work do I deny that. That my work focuses specifically on the particular relationship that Black people have to the music industry in this country does not mean others were not being exploited. But he is factually incorrect if he is suggesting that all of these groups are equally related to this political economy of music and equally exploited for the exact same reasons. That is factually and historically incorrect. And I demonstrate that in my book by talking about the history of pop culture in this country, which has always been based on the exploitation of the performance of blackness, first by by white folks, then by Black folks, performing a version of blackness that supports white comfort. So he can say I'm wrong in that, but to ignore the argument and just lump me in with Norman Kelly, maybe simply because he saw that I cited Kelly at one point in my book, I don't know. But that's not, but he's getting this for me all wrong. But rather than analysis and critique of bourgeois social relations in the music industry, hip hop scholars like Jared Ball fall back on empty rhetoric. And then he starts throwing jabs, pun intended. Ball simply tells us that copyright ownership, for example, is a form of colonialism. Is that all I said? Is that all I said in the entire chapter about copyright? I get it, it's not a long chapter, but or Ball informs us that that capitalist firms are more concerned with control over popular form of colonized cultural expression than the simple extraction of material wealth and goods from a colony. Hogwash, he says. But does he explain why I said that? So if we go back a few minutes, if you remember, I already said how he ignored the fact that I do indeed include a breakdown of how the industry works and its impact. He ignored all of that, right? So for him to now come back and say that I'm only concerned with the simple extraction of that I'm only concerned with control over the popular form of colonized cultural expression more so than the simple extraction of material wealth and goods and colony without wealth from goods in the colony without explaining how I got there, that is hogwash, not my argument. His approach, his misrepresentation of my work is hogwash and is itself empty rhetoric because the point of that particular chapter is in fact, I do say that the companies are more interested in the management of the popular form not because they're not interested in material wealth, but as I showed in the part that he leaves out in this chapter, is that when you break down the ownership of these companies and you see that their relationship to the conglomerates that own them, it to me begs the question. So, for instance, when I said that Sony Music, one of the big three, or big four, Sony Music is only 6% of Sony Corporation. When I showed that Universal Music Group, the biggest music company in the world to this day, was only 14% at the time of Vivendi's overall operation. And when I showed that Warner Music Group, the third in the big three or four, whatever, was only 3% of Blavatnik's overall private equity operation that owned it, I was saying if it was about making money, again, not that 14%, not that 6%, not that 3% are insignificant, but it seems to me that their interests are otherwise, that they're making a bulk of their money elsewhere. So why then all this investment in time in managing and owning all this music? My argument was it has more to do with managing the messaging and the content and its impact socially, in addition to making the money. The usage of internal colony theory to explain the class exploitation of Black musicians is idealist rubbish. Plain and simple, the extraction of surplus value from commodity production via exploitation is a necessary condition for the reproduction of capital in the music industry. So correct me if I'm wrong, he's saying that the only purpose for exploiting musicians is to create capital to reproduce the social or labor relations in the music industry. I don't see how that makes my argument hogwash. If part of maintaining these social relations necessitates by the work I cite all the time, by the very people who construct this cognitive warfare environment, the manipulation of public opinion, the manipulation of popular symbol and narrative is essential to the maintenance of these social relations. It is not simply enough to manipulate or exploit materially the labor, which obviously is happening. Similarly, by ignoring the specifics of the Black experience in this country and the relationship that race plays in all of this, and this again need of the colonizer to reaffirm itself in the reproduction of coloniality and the image of the oppressed, I just it just doesn't work for me to call that hogwash and rubbish again while not doing the work, because that's it to the reference of me. So there's no further explanation of how he's arguing this based on his reading of my work. And just to be fair, I'll just want to show all of these references. In contrast to the arguments presented by Jared Ball and others, I think it is important to clearly understand that white musicians in no way benefit from Black musicians being exploited. I never said white musicians benefit from Black musicians being exploited. So again, he's I'm sorry, I meant to say earlier, he doesn't steel man my argument by actually exploring it, laying it out, and then showing its weaknesses. He straw mans my argument as he does again here, quoting me out of context, not really quoting me properly at all, not investigating my work at all, just throwing me in here as he goes about making the rest of his points. So I never said that white musicians benefit. In fact, I was saying white corporations benefit and white society in general, particularly the elite, benefit from having their place as settler colonial ruling elite reaffirmed through the projection of an anti-Black popular Black image. To argue the contrary, to ignore the objective phenomenon of socialized production, where all workers sell their labor power, which is privately appropriated by the bourgeoisie. So he said white musicians don't benefit, but I said a white supremacist colony absolutely does. But again, I agree that there should be a a union of workers. But as my father, I agree with he and his comrades' efforts at one point, at least in its initial state, that even within the labor movement, the union movement, there should be a coalition of Black trade unionists, or in this case, a coalition of Black hip hop artists, et cetera, and so forth. But again, I don't, Ferguson is smart enough and capable enough to properly engage my work and show where the flaws are. I found flaws in it, but what he did here is just not is inaccurate and unfair. So first of all, you can just see where, just through the chapter breakdown here, I try to lay out my colony approach through internal colonialism. Media is ideology. Education is part of this. Journalism is part of this. Revisiting the corporation and cultural industry. Where do I get the name cultural industry? From Theodore Adorno and his crew. And then I go through the whole industry. Dominant institution, the musical OPEC that own and disseminate over 95% of all music CDs in the Western world. Here's a breakdown of the music companies. Here's a breakdown of I even talk about board interlocks and show how all these boards how these companies overlap and interlock and interrelate with one another, and how they're owned and they're subsidiaries of larger conglomerates. Here's the breakdown here, and the money that the wealth that they produce. I show their ties to other elements of the corporate world. So I'm like, I don't, and then, the politics of popular culture with a quote from Thomas Porter right out the gate. It's very important to understand that music, like all art, regardless of its form, is ideological. Does that sound like someone who's only looking at this exclusively for the exploitation of labor? Come on, man. Intellectual property, copyright, and the ownership of thought. The big four. Copyright as an industry. Intellectual property is an industry. The history of copyright with its origins in 18th century modern capitalism. I would go back to its origins and give, you know what I'm saying? Come on, son, I'm doing this in like a few pages. I even shout out Marx. Copyrights are now tradable commodity. through which our cultural heritage has been privatized. So I don't understand. I'm just not clear how he's saying I even cite Marx again, that they control the means of mental production, the consciousness industry. And I do show that that when you own people's intellectual property, when you own copyright, you can manipulate their behavior. You can manipulate who benefits from what they produce. You can manipulate who sees and doesn't see what is produced. I said the copyright oligopoly's real desire is to create an international police state dedicated to the protection of their rights. So I'm even connecting it to police. Come on, man. Come on. Come on. Payola and playlists, breaking down exactly how people paid to get music into popular rotation and the impact that that has both financially and otherwise. So I just, again, Ferguson just, as I said to him in the email, he did me dirty. Like that was just dirty drive-by, intellectual drive-by. And I just don't get why, like, I'm like, so we'll see. Maybe he'll come on here and whatever.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.